Well, Dr. Adedikwe, we've been hearing a lot of reactions with regard to this strike that has been declared by organized labor. The Office of the Attorney General says it is premature, illegal, ineffectual. Organized private sector says the demand is unrealistic. Government, which is the third part of the, the tripartite negotiations, says, where will government find the money from? They are asking for close to about 12 trillion naira, going by the demands, including the removal of electricity hike. And now the country has been shut down, more or less. The national grid, the transmission commission, transmission company of Nigeria says the national grid is down. Pengasan, Nopeng, nurses and others, about 18 unions are part of this this strike. So what's your take?
Thank you so very much. Now, my first perspective to this is to look at the economy in total. Now, what was our GDP first quarter of this year? 58.8 trillion naira. Now, if you pair that on a daily basis, we'll be looking at about 653 billion naira daily in terms of output. So in which case, if we continue on this industrial action, that is how much this economy is hemorrhaging on a daily basis. But you can further break it down and now say, okay, look, what percentage of this value created on a daily basis can be adduced to the public sector vis-a-vis the private sector? So you can now also ask that if we have all the entire public sector shut down by reason of this industrial action, what portion of that will we lose on a daily basis? And then, to what extent can this also disrupt activities in the private sector? If we assume 30% of what happens in the private sector, that means we could be looking at a figure of almost 305.9 billion naira every day that this economy is losing by reason of this industrial action. Now, taking it from that perspective, it means this doesn't pay any of the parties involved. And that is the three parties to the negotiation: the government, the private sector, and of course, even the labor that is supposed to be a beneficiary of whatever any of these actors or agents do on a daily basis. So from that perspective then, I will say there's a compelling reason for all the actors to return to the table. And that's my take of this. It's a compelling reason to return to the table. And the argument we usually make in negotiation is this: negotiation takes place at the table, not outside of the room where it's supposed to happen. Not on the streets, not even in the media, or perhaps, as we commonly joke in Nigeria, in the beer parlors. Okay? So in which case, the parties need to return to the table and now also advise themselves. And I'm putting this in this way as responsibility on the three sides to the table as leaders. And that is, what are the likely outcomes when we negotiate? There are 6 of them. I've been teaching negotiation for over 30 years, in tertiary institutions and of course the corporate sector. 6 possible outcomes, but the best of it all is win-win. In which case we all walk off from the table and we win. But if we look at what the labor is asking for, 494,000 naira per month as minimum. If you work out the numbers with 1.2 million workers, that gives you a figure of about 5.48 million naira per person. When you multiply by 1.2 million people, you are looking at an annual figure of about 7.114 trillion naira. But that is basic, by the way. When you factor in the allowances, you are looking at a figure of about 9.5 trillion. Now, the concern to me as an economist is that when you put all of this together and now look at our estimated population today at about 228 million people. Now, if we play that against our population policy, 1 man, 1 wife, 4 children, that means if you divide that by 6, you'll be talking about 38 million breadwinners in Nigeria. Now, if these 38 million breadwinners across public and private sectors will earn salaries, allowances at this rate Labour is proposing, that gives us an annual bill of 225 trillion naira.
Inflation.
Now, if you also annualize our GDP for first quarter of this year, that is assuming the economic grows at the same rate for the rest of the year, we'll be looking at a total of 235 trillion naira, which means the estimated implication of this at 225 trillion naira vis-a-vis the GDP projected for this year at 235 is 96.6%. In which case, the bulk of what we produce this year as a nation, we're going to pay wage bills across public and private sectors.
Okay, in summary.
So that is unproductive.
You are saying that it is unproductive.
It is.
It is unrealistic.
It is unrealistic.
It is unreasonable.
Yeah,
so you think the
my
government of Nigeria, is in a strong position.
In my,
100% increase they are proposing.
Now, why are we tend more on the side of the 100% increase is this. Now, when it comes to negotiation of wage bills, there are 5 major factors to consider. One is the cost of living, which is the one the labor is weighing very heavily. We can talk about assigning weight to them. But labor assigns a lot of weight to cost of living. But there are also other issues relating to affordability, sustainability, fairness. Yes, fairness means on both sides, at least to the one paying and the one that is receiving. So when you play the balance, it means on both sides of the table, we should be looking at those factors before we take a pitch.
All right. So I hear you, and you say that the best outcome for a negotiation like this would be a win-win situation.
Win-win, that's right.
Currently, win-win doesn't sound like 60,000 naira, according from organized labor's perspective. So it's a win, not win for labor, organized labor, and for the masses. A number of people have said that how are we going to afford living if you give us 60,000 naira as a minimum wage? What would be an ideal win-win situation? Except you're saying that 60,000 naira is, well, which clearly isn't. But what would be labor, organized labor, going, because they're going back to the negotiation table. They haven't said, by the way, that this industrial strike action will stop negotiations. They said whilst that is ongoing, they will continue, at least in the immediate. So they're still going to be speaking to the government, and government on its own needs to also be responsible. Yeah. What would look like a win-win situation? What should organized labor really be pushing for in terms of representing the people?
Well, for the organized labor, it's more from the perspective of we are looking at what can sustain us, but at the same time, we want to be sure that all of us still remain in employment. And in fact, if you play back the experience of Japan, that has most likely the most competitive public service in the world today. And of course, their template was followed by Malaysia, and of course, look at UK, which means you are striking a balance now between what labor receives and their productivity. And of course, the other side is ability to pay. So when you play all of those things against each other, what we likely find is if we shoot up so high, then it means the wage bill becomes so high, and then we have to come back to the numbers. Okay, do we then reduce the numbers? Certainly, the government also doesn't want that.
Not to lose work.
Because that will also extenuate unemployment. So they don't want that. None of us want that. Okay? So in which case, we ask ourselves, yes, 60,000 naira, by all means, the government says it's already 100% above the current position. So, but for the organized private sector, let me now say now, the question is this something we can afford? And don't forget, this is just basic. Allowances are heavier in the private sector. In the public sector, allowance is roughly about 30% of the basic. So which accounts for the difference between 7.1 trillion and 9.5 trillion, as the government said. So which means then that the issue of affordability becomes very heavy when you consider this. Because if I can't afford it, the next thing will be, I have to reduce the number of staff.
Okay. So I think, in understanding these arguments, another factor you should put in your analysis after for fairness, sustainability, affordability, cost of living, is economic dynamics.
Correct.
I think you should put that as a sixth factor because, you see, the argument Labour keeps making, and I've heard them here come a couple of times, is the economic dynamics, and they compare and they make a case, in America it happens this way. And yes, America bumped up its, rate of wage after COVID, which was determined by the workers themselves,
Correct.
which led to an attendant inflation. But we don't have that economic dynamics here. You were talking about 1.2 million workers getting, this humongous amount. When we forget that the labor force in Nigeria is about 75 million. And this money is just for 1.2 million out of the 75 million, which relatively most of the other people are still in the organized private sector. And the organized private sector is saying we can only afford 54,000.
Yeah.
I mean, they were here 2 weeks ago, and that was their argument that even before we even talked about 60, they can't afford 60.
Yeah.
That's their argument. And at the same time, you're still having some states that are saying, oh, I can pay 70,000. I'm going to pay 70,000 like Edo State.
Yeah.
So where is the meeting halfway? And also, have you extrapolated the inflationary gain from, let's pursue two scenarios. I think a realistic scenario is one between 100 to 200,000. Inflationary gain between 100 to 200,000 wage. Inflationary gain between 300,000 wage. And inflationary gain between this 400,000 threshold Labour is talking about. Have we tried to pursue the inflationary scenarios? Because the argument of government of is just going to add 9.5 trillion to our wage is a weak argument. Government should have also posited the inflationary scenario to be able to make a better argument.
Well, that is the whole essence of negotiation. What are the issues? What are the factors? Happily for us in Nigeria, we have the benefit of experience.
Udoji, in the 70s.
So what did that do?
40% inflation rate from about 10-15%
Triggered
inflation rate.
inflationary pressures.
Yeah.
We saw a similar thing play out in the late 80s, early 90s, especially in response to what we refer to then as the SAP riots in May 1989. Okay? Now, I was privileged to do that analysis for the World Bank. I was then a staff of the World Bank and did a paper on inflation in Nigeria as a fallout of that, and then how the government should respond. Okay? Now, at that instance, that led us into the highest ever inflation rate in Nigeria's history, 72%. That's the highest inflation rate we have ever had in Nigeria, historically. So when you play this out, and in fact, I was a part of that conversation in 1993, before we now arrived at that in 94.
Yeah.
And I said,
those were the days where interest rate was 50%.
Thank you.
In this country. 50% interest rate, 45-50% interest rate.
In fact, the highest interest rate in the banking system at the time was 78%. Because at that point in time, I was head of strategy in FCMB. So it was my daily issue that I dealt with. 78% highest lending rate, okay, in this economy. Inflation rate rose to 72%. And so, when you look at all the factors that drove that, and essentially it's like we are playing into that again. So in which case, on all the sides, we must be conscious of the implications of what we are proposing.
Okay, Dr. Adedipe, let me ask you. The range, in terms of the disagreements, is so wide. Government says 60%, or organized private sector says 60%. Labor has climbed down from 615 to 494. Where do you think that meeting ground will be? That's my first question. The second one is to ask you, I mean, you've been in banking, you've been in consulting, you've been in academics. Now, what's your assessment? Since this is the occasion of the 1 year in government of Tinubu, what's your assessment of what has been done so far with monetary policy and fiscal policy under Tinubu in the last 1 year?
Very good question. Let me start with the first one, the meeting point. Now, I won't recommend the option of compromise, because compromise in negotiations and outcome is weaker than win-win. Win-win means all of us parties to the negotiation see the issues that are on the table, and then we come to a common understanding that now leads us into an agreement.
What will be that fair agreement?
Now, if I look at it as an employer of labor, because I've been in business now for over 30 years in this country, okay? And I know what played out during COVID, like you made reference earlier on. I simply called the staff of the company, we sat at the table, we put the figures before everyone, and we said, these are the options. If we have to sustain what we pay now and no income because our business is non-essential, it means we have to ask some of us to go. Now, if we won't ask anyone to go, and we have to remain here together as a team, it means another option is to reduce pay for that period. But when business returns to normal, then we go back to where we were. And if things now stabilize and we start to grow, we can now increase, which also played out in my own company. Okay? So in which case, bring all the facts on the table, and then I can then say as an employer of labor, that is something I can afford. I see the OPS coming from that perspective.
So in other words, it's not a win-win situation.
It's not a win-win.
We're dealing with.
We are not dealing with a win-win.
Some people will lose.
Certainly.
So it's a zero-sum game.
Well, now, I would rather say, if we are not careful, we may be heading towards lose-lose.
Wow. Nash equilibrium.
And that is not a good option.
That's not ideal.
It's not an ideal outcome.
Okay, monetary policy.
I feel like you haven't yet answered. I don't know if you are shying away from answering in terms of what the organized labor should be asking for. I'm asking it because it might give an opportunity. We have a number of people who are listening, and they also put pressure on organized labor when they go to the negotiation table. What is realistic? I would just like you to give a number, because are you staying with the government to 60,000 naira, or the tripartite committee, the government and organized private sector side, or are you saying that they could up the number a bit, and then organized labor should understand with the analysis on the economic impact that they should stay on that number? What would you recommend? Just a figure, except you're saying 6,000.
I mean, if I were at the negotiation table,
yes,
I would probably say, okay, we can move a little bit. It is a gesture in negotiation.
Yes.
But you don't necessarily have to move all the way. So, but the important thing is to sell that message. Just like my brother Rufai said.
100K.
Okay?
100K.
That there is a need to consider the implication of pushing the figure so high.
Yes.
And what that can also do in returning us to where we escaped 1994-95.
Can they afford 100K?
That is an issue for me. I don't think they can afford it. That's the reality.
Okay.
Because I played the numbers.
Okay, good. And also, I think the government should also play the inflation scenarios across 100, 300, 400K, and put the numbers. I think we also strengthen the argument, not just it's going to be the
right.